Snow fell, like ash, over the camp, soft but merciless, burying sound before it could live. Beyond the fences, the world was at war. Inside, time had frozen into silence. The kind of silence that didn't bring peace, only the echo of everything that had been taken. Barbed wire gleamed faintly in the pale morning light. Rows of wooden barracks hunched under the cold, each window fogged with the breath of men who no longer spoke unless they had to. The air was heavy with smoke, fatigue, and the muffled rhythm of boots on ice. Orders were barked in German, clipped, efficient, then swallowed by the wind. There was no laughter here, no songs, no melody. Only the dull scrape of shovels, the rattle of tin bowls, and the hiss of the guard's whistle slicing through the cold. The men worked with heads bowed, their movements mechanical, their eyes vacant, as though their spirits had retreated to some quiet place within where war couldn't reach them. In one corner of the compound stood a long hall used by the officers. Inside, against the far wall, rested a piano, or what used to be one. Its lid hung crookedly, half the keys broken or missing, its strings tangled like veins in an old wound. Dust clung to it in layers. No one played it, no one dared, yet somehow its presence filled the room with a quiet defiance, a relic of a world that once believed in beauty. Sometimes, when the guard smoked near the window, one would glance at it and smirk. "It hasn't made a sound in years," they would say. They were wrong. It did make a sound, not of music, but of memory. A mute reminder that somewhere, once, people gathered around light instead of fire, around harmony instead of orders. At dusk, when the snow turned blue and shadows stretched long across the wire, the prisoners would return from labor, each step heavier than the last. A few would look toward the officers' hall, not out of defiance, but longing. They didn't know why. Maybe they could sense it, that somewhere, behind those locked doors, a small piece of the old world waited, broken, but not gone. A guard coughed, a door slammed, and the moment vanished. The camp fell quiet again. That night, the wind carried faint notes from far away, the hum of distant artillery, the growl of engines, the whisper of frost against tin roofs. It was a cruel kind of music, born of machines instead of hands. Yet, in that emptiness, even those sounds seemed alive. The prisoners lay still in their bunks, staring at the ceiling. Some thought of home, of church bells, laughter, pianos that played real tunes. Others thought of nothing. The war had taken their voices, but somewhere, behind snow and silence, the world still remembered how to sing. And though no one knew it yet, the forgotten piano, that quiet ghost of another time, was waiting for the man who would bring its voice back to life. The camp gates groaned open one gray morning, their hinges screaming against the cold. A truck rumbled in, tires cutting through half-frozen mud. The guard shouted in German, sharp, practiced commands that cracked the air like whips. Inside the truck, new prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed, hands trembling from the long journey. Among them was Private Arthur Bell, thin, pale, his uniform hanging loose around his frame. He looked less like a soldier and more like a man who'd forgotten what sunlight felt like. His eyes, however, calm, steady, watchful, seemed to carry a different kind of strength. When the others shivered or coughed, Arthur listened. He always listened. As he stepped out, a gust of icy wind struck him full in the face. He didn't flinch. He simply looked around, taking in the sight. Barbed wire like a black crown against the sky, the watchtowers, the hollow faces of men who had already surrendered to silence. Somewhere far off, a bell rang, not a church bell, a work bell, metal and merciless. A guard shoved him forward. "Move!" Arthur stumbled, then straightened. His boots crunched over snow that had turned to glass. The other prisoners watched him, not with curiosity, but with the dull recognition of men who knew what came next. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with smoke and damp wool. The newcomers were given numbers, not names. Arthur's was 8263. The guard wrote it down without looking up, as though he were recording the inventory of a broken machine. That night, Arthur lay awake on a wooden bunk, staring at the ceiling. The man beside him whispered, "Don't talk, don't ask questions, do what they say." Then silence again, the camp's only rule. But Arthur's mind wandered elsewhere. Before the war, he had worked in a piano shop in Leeds, a quiet place filled with sound. His fingers knew the weight of ivory keys, the delicate tension of strings being tuned just right. Now they were blistered and raw, made for digging trenches instead of coaxing melody. As he drifted toward sleep, he thought he heard something, a faint note, maybe the memory of one. He imagined the sound of a piano key pressed softly and then swallowed by the wind. His chest tightened. He turned on his side, away from the others, and let the thought fade before it could hurt. Outside, a German guard named Hans leaned on his rifle, watching the barracks. To him, the prisoners all looked the same, gray men in gray snow. He spat, muttered something about English dogs, and walked away. But inside, one man, the quiet one, with the careful eyes, was listening to the world differently. The war had taken his freedom, his music, his name, but not yet his hearing, and in a camp built on obedience and noise, that would soon matter more than anyone could imagine. The mornings began the same way, a whistle, the clatter of boots, the rattle of tin bowls. The guards barked orders in clipped German while prisoners lined up for watery soup and counted hours until dark. For most, time was an enemy. For Arthur, it was a rhythm, harsh, mechanical, but still a rhythm. In the officers' quarters, warmth glowed from stoves and cigarettes. There the German guards gathered each evening to watch propaganda reels flicker across a white sheet pinned to the wall. Grainy black and white images showed proud German soldiers, smiling, victorious, the Reich's music swelling beneath their triumph. Between frames of parades and flags, the British were shown as devils, cowards, cheats, unfeeling men who burned cities and prayed to money. Hans, the young guard, laughed. "See, these are your people," he would say to no one in particular, his voice full of confidence borrowed from the screen. He didn't yet know that belief could be a kind of blindness. Arthur worked outside those walls, hauling wood and shoveling snow. Yet through the cracks of the officers' hall, he sometimes caught the muffled plump of those reels, the sound of triumph turned hollow by repetition. The music was too perfect, too loud. It was meant to drown out doubt. At night back in the barracks, the men whispered stories of home, but Arthur stayed quiet. He listened to their accents, Welsh, Scottish, Londoner, all sounding distant now, like ghosts of a world that had forgotten them. Then, when the camp grew still, he would hum, barely audible, more breath than sound, a slow tune, fragile as smoke. The first time he did it, a prisoner hissed, "Stop! You'll get us all punished." Arthur obeyed, but the tune remained, unfinished, suspended. The next night he hummed again, softer. Someone recognized it, a hymn once sung in churches before the war. No one joined in, but no one stopped him either. From outside, Hans heard it once while patrolling. He frowned. "The Englishman is singing," he told another guard. "Madness." But he didn't shout, didn't interrupt.
Because in a world made entirely of noise, he had remembered what silence could mean. It began as a whisper among the prisoners. "He's going to ask the commandant." The idea seemed absurd, almost dangerous. In a place where men begged for food and mercy, one of them was planning to ask for music. Arthur waited for his moment. He'd spent days rehearsing it in his head, the right words, the right tone. In a world ruled by suspicion, even kindness could look like defiance. But he couldn't let the piano die, not while it still existed. That morning, frost coated the camp like glass. Prisoners shuffled through roll call, their breath hanging in clouds. When the commandant, Major Weiss, emerged from his office, tall, immaculate, his boots spotless despite the mud, Arthur stepped forward. The air seemed to tighten instantly. Guards gripped their rifles. No one moved. "Sir," Arthur said, voice steady but quiet. Weiss looked up, surprised that a prisoner dared to speak. "What is it?" Arthur hesitated. "Then, the piano in the officers' hall. May I repair it?" For a moment, silence. Then laughter, first from Weiss, then from the nearby guards. One spat on the ground. "Repair it? For what, Englishman? To play us lullabies?" Arthur didn't respond. He simply stood there, unblinking, the cold biting through his clothes. Weiss tilted his head, studying him. "You think you can fix it?" "I can try, sir." Weiss's amusement lingered, but behind it, curiosity stirred. "You were a musician?" "A tuner, before the war." Weiss turned away, considering. "Very well. You'll have one day. If you break it further, I'll burn it. If you succeed, perhaps we'll see what use that has." Arthur bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, sir." When he returned to the barracks, the others stared at him in disbelief. One whispered, "You're mad. You just volunteered to amuse them." Another muttered, "He'll make a fool of you." Arthur sat on his bunk, his breath trembling with cold. "Maybe, but at least I'll hear something true again." That night, Weiss poured himself a drink by the fire. "The Englishman," he told Hans, "wants to fix our piano. Let him. Perhaps he'll remember he's not a soldier anymore, only a man." But Hans said nothing. Something about Arthur's eyes that morning had unsettled him. Not pride, not fear, something else. Across the camp, Arthur lay awake, thinking of his mother's living room, of the faint creak of the old floorboard beneath the family piano. He thought of tuning it by candlelight while rain tapped softly on the windows. Now, there were no candles, only a camp, only silence. Yet somewhere beneath that silence, he could already hear it, the first note waiting to be freed. The next morning, a guard led Arthur to the officers' hall. The door creaked open, releasing a faint scent of dust and varnish, the smell of time forgotten. The piano sat there in its quiet ruin. The room was empty except for the guard, who leaned against the wall, amused. Arthur approached the instrument slowly, like one might approach a grave. His hand hovered over the keys before touching them, light as breath. They were stiff, yellowed with age. When he pressed one, it gave a faint broken sound, half note, half sigh. But even that was enough. It was a pulse, proof that something inside still lived. He knelt down, pried open the lid, and stared at the tangled strings. Half were rusted, some snapped clean through. He had no tools, no spare wire, nothing but memory and resolve. Still, he began. He scavenged what he could. Bits of wire from broken cots, wax dripped from candles, rags from discarded uniforms. His fingers bled as he worked, the metal biting deep into his skin. Yet his movements were careful, deliberate, patient. Every adjustment, every touch carried a reverence that no order could strip away. Hours passed. Outside, guards changed shifts, prisoners shoveled snow. The world kept turning. Inside that hall, Arthur tuned the silence itself. The faint creak of wood, the whir of his breath, the tentative ping of a repaired string. It was a symphony only he could hear. At one point, Hans entered, arms crossed. "Why do you bother? No one cares if it plays." Arthur didn't look up. "Then it will play for no one," he said quietly. Hans frowned but didn't reply. He lingered for a while, watching the Englishman's raw hands move with tenderness he didn't understand. Then he left, closing the door behind him. When evening came, Arthur sat back, exhausted. He had managed only a few octaves, uneven, imperfect, but the sound was there. He pressed a key, and a clean note rang out, trembling through the cold air. It was fragile, uncertain, like a bird testing its wings. For a moment, Arthur just listened. Then he smiled. A small, private thing, gone as quickly as it came. The guard returned, unimpressed. Enough for today. Arthur stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. As he walked out, he glanced once more at the piano, now patched with scraps and sweat. It looked no less broken, but somehow more alive. That night in the barracks, his fingers still twitched as though playing invisible notes. He fell asleep to the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Steady, human, alive. In a camp built to erase sound, he had made the silence sing again. Days bled into one another, the same gray mornings, the same cold, the same silence. But something had changed. The guards didn't see it, the officers didn't feel it, yet the prisoners did. When Arthur passed by, men lifted their eyes, just briefly. Hope had a new shape, not a weapon, not a letter from home, but a man repairing a piano in secret. Weiss had allowed him to continue, out of amusement, perhaps curiosity. He'd said, "Let the Englishman have his hobby. It keeps him quiet." But the quiet had begun to hum with life. One morning, the hall was colder than usual. Frost had crept across the windows like veins. Arthur stood before the piano once more. He flexed his hands, swollen, cracked, but steady, and pressed a key, then another. The sound was uneven, rough, but real. For weeks he had labored in half-light, tuning by ear, trusting instinct over instruments. Now, as he sat on the uneven bench, he took a breath. Around him, two guards leaned against the wall, whispering to each other, bored. Arthur began to play. The first notes were hesitant, fragile things that almost broke apart before they formed. Then came more, small clusters of sound, weaving into something faintly recognizable. A melody emerged, halting but true. It wasn't triumphal. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of music born of memory, of longing, something between prayer and forgiveness. Outside, the prisoners paused at the sound. The clink of shovels stilled. The air shifted as though the snow itself was listening. Inside, one guard straightened. Another stopped laughing. The piano filled the space like breath returning to lungs. Weiss entered quietly, his boots echoing. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood, smoke curling from his cigarette, eyes unreadable. Arthur kept playing. His fingers moved with a rhythm that came from somewhere deeper than practice, a pulse of who he used to be. For the first time in years, he wasn't a number or a uniform. He was simply a man making sound in a world that had forgotten how. The melody rose, then fell, like a story told without words. Every key struck against the cold room, every note a contradiction, beauty where there should be despair, grace where there should be obedience. When the final chord trembled into silence, no one spoke. The guards didn't mock him. Weiss didn't give an order. Even the air seemed reluctant to move. Arthur sat for a long moment, his hands resting on the keys. He had played not for them, not for himself, but for everything the war had taken. And outside, the men who heard it would later swear, for those few minutes, the camp had stopped breathing. The next day, word spread quietly through the camp. The Englishman made the piano sing. No one knew how or why the guards had allowed it, but the rumor carried warmth through the